The sea on a winter's night has a way of silencing the world, as if the ocean itself is holding its breath. Above the surface, the half-moon hung pale and distant, laying a thin ribbon of silver across the long Pacific swells. Each wave rose and fell in an ancient rhythm that felt untouched by war, cold, steady, indifferent to the thousands of ships and millions of lives struggling across the planet. The only sound was the soft hiss of wind over water, coming in faint, broken whispers. To a sailor standing watch that night aboard a Japanese destroyer, the scene might have seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. A deceptive kind of calm that only the experienced recognized as dangerous. Because beneath that shimmering surface, hidden in the cold, dark layers of the sea, a predator was stalking its prey. That predator was USS Archerfish, a Below-class submarine of the United States Navy. 311 feet of welded American steel, painted in dull wartime gray. When she surfaced, her conning tower was only a jagged shadow against the moonlit horizon. When she slipped beneath the waves, her periscope and radar mast cut so low across the surface they barely seemed real. Inside the pressure hull, the air was close and heavy, thick with the scent of oil, sweat, metal, and machinery. Men moved through the cramped passageways with practiced efficiency, hands brushing valves, gauges, and chart tables as if the submarine itself were a living creature they guided through the deep. Their voices never rose above murmurs. After years of combat patrols, the crew understood that silence was survival. But tonight, an unspoken tension lingered. Something felt different. Something big was unfolding, and everyone sensed it. At the heart of it stood Commander Joseph F. Enright, 33 years old, dark-eyed, methodical, and carrying a quiet burden. Months earlier, he had returned from a patrol without firing a single torpedo. His hesitation had cost him dearly. In wartime submarine service, failing to attack wasn't just disappointing. It was a mark of shame, a scar on a man's competence and confidence. Enright had even asked to be relieved, convinced that his instincts had betrayed him. He carried that memory into every moment now. Tonight, in the black winter waters south of Honshu, he intended to erase that failure forever. Enright stood at the periscope, one hand resting lightly on the grips, the other brushing the rosary in his pocket. He'd never call himself devout, but when the weight of command settled on his shoulders, the beads brought him calm, and tonight that responsibility felt heavier than ever. Somewhere beyond the northern horizon, past the jagged line of Tokyo Bay's headlands, a massive Japanese vessel was underway. The radar operator had spotted it first, a single blip 12 miles out, moving steadily southwest. Large, very large. Too large to be a tanker or transport. Too large to ignore. Enright's gut told him this was no ordinary freighter. But what was it? Archerfish had been sitting on lifeguard duty earlier in the night, waiting to rescue downed American aviators from bombing raids that never launched. Now free to patrol, she had stumbled across a target by sheer chance, one whose significance no one aboard yet understood. Enright's mind raced through possibilities. Japan's great battleships. Yamato. Could she be venturing out again? Or was this something new, something the Americans hadn't seen before? The submarine shifted as she came onto a new course. In the control room, sailors bent over the plotting board, drawing relative motion lines with grease pencils, adjusting bearings with measured precision. Geometry, timing, and nerve, those were the weapons now. One wrong calculation, one sloppy decision, and not only would the target escape, but the destroyers escorting her could easily turn the hunter into the hunted. For now, Archerfish kept her distance, running on the surface, hidden by the night and by thin clouds smothering the moon. Inside the boat, life tightened like a coiled spring. Torpedo men slept beside the warheads in the forward compartment. Officers rotated through shared bunks. Every man knew exactly where he'd go if the alarm sounded. The submarine hummed with constant noise, ventilation fans, pumps, the low throb of diesel engines when surfaced. Sweat-stained khakis clung to skin. The air felt dense, almost electric. Every sound, the creak of the hull, the slap of the bow, the faint buzz of the radar, felt sharper than usual. Enright had vowed months earlier never to hesitate again. He remembered sitting across a poker table at Midway Naval Base, bluffing hard, pushing the stakes, when a senior officer had looked him dead in the eye and asked, "Joe, Would you command a submarine the way you play cards? Enright had answered without blinking. Yes. That answer had earned him another chance. Tonight, that chance was sailing just miles ahead of him. What Enright could not yet know was the true scale of the giant he was stalking. The ship in front of him was Shinano, the pride of Japanese shipyards. At nearly 72,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. Secretly built, rushed to completion, and manned by an inexperienced crew, she represented a final desperate hope for Japan. Instead, she was steaming straight into the path of a single American submarine commanded by a man seeking redemption. The moon vanished behind a passing cloud, plunging the horizon into deeper shadow. For a moment, even the ocean seemed to draw still. Enright pressed his eye to the periscope again. The silhouette was there, faint but unmistakably enormous. He could see the escorts moving around her, small dark shapes slicing the water beside the massive ship. One destroyer abruptly turned toward Archerfish, accelerating hard. For a heartbeat, the crew braced for impact, the terrible moment when the hunted realizes it's been discovered. But then, just as suddenly, the destroyer veered sharply, returned to station, and vanished back into the darkness. The window of opportunity remained open. "Stay with her," Enright whispered to his officers. "Calm, firm, focused. Let her zig. Watch where she straightens out." His voice carried more than orders. It carried a promise. To his crew, to his record, to himself. He would not let doubt win again. This time, he would act. Midnight approached. Ahead of them, the largest warship ever built pushed through the night, unaware that beneath the cold Pacific surface, a single submarine and her determined captain had locked her in their sights. The stage was set. The geometry was aligning, and the greatest undersea ambush of the Pacific War was about to begin. The year was 1944, deep into the most violent conflict the world had ever seen, and the tide of World War II had turned with a force too powerful for anyone to deny. For Japan, the empire that once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the dream of expansion had vanished. The war was no longer fought to conquer. It was fought simply to survive. What had once been a vast defensive perimeter was collapsing. The Pacific, once the empire's natural shield, had shrunk into a tightening ring of fire. Every month the battlefield moved closer to Japan's heart. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, then the Marianas, each island captured by the United States brought the war another step toward Tokyo. And with every American landing, Japan's position grew weaker. Supplies dwindled, bases fell silent, and entire garrisons were cut off or wiped out. Fuel was running dry. Ammunition stocks thinned. Morale bled away. The empire found itself outmatched on every front. By the summer of 1944, the Philippines campaign was underway. General Douglas MacArthur, true to his dramatic promise, had returned, fighting his way through Leyte and Luzon. At the same time, Admiral Chester Nimitz drove the might of the U.S. Pacific Fleet westward toward Okinawa. The oceans that had once carried Japan's power now belonged to American submarines. The silent service ruled the deep. Submarines like USS Archerfish had sliced Japan's merchant fleet to pieces. Tankers carrying precious oil from the East Indies went down faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships carrying food, steel, and munitions were easy prey for patient American captains armed with torpedoes and radar. By 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet, and the consequences were catastrophic. Factories sputtered. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Even essential supplies, rice, medicine, steel, rubber, became difficult to find. The mathematics of war, once in Japan's favor, had swung brutally against them. Every ship sunk was gone forever. Every aircraft destroyed left a hole that could not be filled. The great shipyards that once produced the fleet that struck Pearl Harbor were now struggling just to patch holes. Steel was scarce. Skilled workers had been drafted into the military, and high above Japan's factories, American B-29s began appearing, gleaming silver giants bringing firestorms to Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. The Imperial Navy, once the most modern sea power in the world, had become a ghost of its former strength. Its air arm had been shredded at Midway. Its battleships battered in the Solomons and the Marianas. And in October 1944, at the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history, Japan threw everything it had left into one last desperate gamble. The result was ruin. Carriers such as Zuikaku, proud veteran of Pearl Harbor, went down in flames. The mighty Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, was hammered to death under waves of American bombs and torpedoes. Even Yamato herself, the largest battleship ever built, limped away damaged and humiliated. But Japan's losses went beyond steel and oil. The human cost was even worse. The elite aviators who once shocked the world at Pearl Harbor and sailed across the Pacific with confidence and deadly skill, they were gone. Their replacements were barely trained, sometimes with fewer than 50 hours in the cockpit before facing battle. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived seasoned, confident, and well prepared. The skies became slaughterhouses. Kill ratios of 10-1, or worse, were common. Japan was running out of aircraft, out of pilots, out of hope. Yet even in this near-hopeless moment, Japanese leaders clung to one last idea, that a single powerful new weapon might change everything, if only long enough to slow the American advance. That weapon wasn't a new aircraft. It wasn't a new super battleship. It was something the world had never seen before. An aircraft carrier so massive, so heavily armored, and so secret that Allied intelligence didn't even know it existed. Her name was Shinano, named after an ancient province. She was born from the unfinished hull of a Yamato-class battleship, repurposed into something Japan hoped would be untouchable, a floating fortress. A carrier so large she could operate as a mobile repair base, capable of servicing, rearming, and launching aircraft even under attack. A ship Japan hoped could anchor the final defensive line around the home islands. If Shinano could survive long enough, she might help stop the American invasion fleets that everyone knew were coming. Japanese strategists envisioned her carrying new special attack weapons, suicide aircraft, rocket-powered planes, and explosive motorboats. Grim weapons born of grim calculations, designed to trade Japanese lives for American ships at acceptable ratios. But the reality of war closed in faster than hope could keep pace. Shipyard crews worked brutal 16-hour shifts. Materials were short. Construction quality slipped. Deadlines were impossible. The ship was rushed out, incomplete, untested, fragile in ways no one wanted to admit. Japan needed Shinano, not next month, not next year, but now. In Tokyo, leaders clung to fading illusions. If Shinano could launch a full air group, perhaps she could bring down swarms of B-29s. If she could reach the Philippines, she might disrupt MacArthur's landings. If she could appear off Okinawa or Taiwan, her size alone might shake the confidence of the US Navy. But Shinano was steaming into a Pacific where illusions could not save her, and where one American submarine waited in silence beneath the waves. The war was slipping away from Japan's grasp. Everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it aloud. Yet somewhere in the halls of Tokyo's Naval Command, a fragile hope survived. Perhaps, just perhaps, one great ship could delay the inevitable collapse. But hope is not strength. And by late 1944, Japan was drawing on measures that revealed just how desperate the empire had become. The Kamikaze Corps, portrayed as the ultimate expression of devotion, was in truth a stark admission that conventional warfare was no longer possible. Young pilots, many barely old enough to shave, were being told that their greatest service to the emperor was to die by ramming their aircraft into American ships. It was a strategy wrapped in the language of honor, but born entirely out of despair. The seas around Japan reflected that same reality. Once dominated by the Imperial Navy, they had become a hunting ground for American submarines. These silent predators operated in coordinated wolf packs of 3 or 4 boats, striking convoys with clinical precision and sinking escorts and merchant vessels alike. By late November, as the massive carrier Shinano prepared to leave her shipyard, dozens of submarines lay in wait around the approaches to Tokyo Bay. The Americans had divided the coastline into tightly patrolled sectors, each submarine responsible for its zone, all working together to intercept anything that dared to leave port. Most of those submarines had no idea that Shinano even existed, but one would cross her path, and that single encounter would decide the fate of Japan's final supercarrier. Strategically, the truth was already painfully clear. Japan had lost the war. The only unanswered questions were how long the fighting would continue, and how many lives would be sacrificed before the inevitable end. But for the sailors, shipbuilders, and pilots caught in the grinding machinery of war, that clarity didn't exist. Their world had no room for surrender. They continued to build, to fight, to hope, because imagining defeat was unthinkable. And so, by November 1944, Japan stood as an empire under siege. Its seas swarmed with unseen predators, its skies burned under American firebombs, and its cities trembled in anticipation of invasion. Into that worsening storm sailed Shinano, a colossal vessel unready, untested, and burdened with the nation's final hopes. And waiting for her, concealed in the black waters beyond Tokyo Bay, was a single submarine commanded by a man searching for redemption. Every great warship begins life not as steel, but as lines of ink, curved shapes on paper that promise power, prestige, and dominance. Shinano's story began the same way, but her destiny would shift again and again before she ever touched open water. She was first conceived in 1940, during the peak of Japan's naval ambition, as the third of the mighty Yamato-class battleships, the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed battleships ever designed. These giants were meant to outmatch anything the American or British fleets could produce. Their armor was thicker, their guns larger, their displacement greater. They embodied an empire confident in its ability to dominate the Pacific. The philosophy behind them was rooted in decades of Japanese naval doctrine. Japan knew it could never match America's industrial-scale ship-for-ship, so it sought superiority through quality. If America could build more ships, Japan would build better ones. A single Yamato-class battleship, they believed, would be worth 2 or 3 American vessels. Their 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, could hurl shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds across distances exceeding 25 miles, punching through armor that would have shattered under lesser fire. 2 of Shinano's sisters, Yamato and Musashi, were completed with these monstrous weapons. Shinano's keel was laid at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's premier shipyards, and everything about her early construction carried the weight of imperial pride. Shinto priests blessed the site. The emperor was notified of the project. The finest steel and most skilled workers were assigned to her. In her original form, she would displace 72,000 tons fully loaded, mount the same colossal guns, and travel at 27 knots despite her massive size. She was intended not just as a weapon, but as a declaration of Japanese naval supremacy. But wars reshaped plans, and in June 1942, everything changed. At Midway, Japan suffered one of the most catastrophic losses in naval history. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Tsuryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed in a single day, along with hundreds of experienced aviators. In that moment, the balance of power in the Pacific tilted permanently. Battleships no longer ruled the oceans, aircraft carriers did. Japanese naval planners stared at Shinano's unfinished hull and realized the truth. Completing her as a battleship would be producing a weapon already made obsolete. But abandoning her was unthinkable. Too much steel, labor, and pride had already been invested. The solution became unavoidable. Shinano would be reborn, not as a battleship, but as the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. The conversion of Shinano from battleship to carrier was nothing short of a naval engineering upheaval. It wasn't a refit, it was a transformation that fought against the very shape of her steel. Her lower hull, originally sculpted to support towering gun turrets and withstand the unimaginable force of 18-inch shells, had to be reimagined for an entirely different purpose. Instead of giant guns, she would now carry aircraft. Instead of heavily armored citadels meant to duel enemy battleships, she would support an enormous hangar deck stretching the length of her spine. Where triple turrets and barbettes would once have risen skyward, massive aircraft elevators were installed, cutting vertically through the armored decks. Her superstructure was torn apart and rebuilt on the starboard side, adopting the now standard silhouette of a fleet carrier. Above it all, engineers constructed a flight deck 840 feet long and 130 feet wide, an expanse of steel large enough to dwarf every carrier afloat at the time. But despite her size, Shinano wasn't designed to spearhead fast carrier task forces the way American Essex-class carriers did. Japan no longer possessed the pilots, planes, or fuel to conduct sweeping offensive strikes. Instead, Shinano was envisioned as something entirely new, a heavily armored support carrier, a mobile fortress designed to repair aircraft in battle, resupply damaged carriers, and carry special attack aircraft, kamikaze planes and explosive-laden motorboats destined for one-way missions. Her main hangar could house 47 aircraft, with parts and storage space for another 70 disassembled and crated, ready to be put together wherever she sailed. This concept reflected Japan's grim reality. By 1944, the empire simply could not replace its aviators. The elite pilots who had carried out the Pearl Harbor attack were mostly gone, replaced by young trainees with barely 50 hours of flight time. Conventional air power was no longer sustainable. Japan needed weapons that required courage, not experience. Shinano was being built to carry those weapons. To protect her during construction, a level of secrecy unlike anything in Japanese shipbuilding history was imposed. The Imperial Navy feared American reconnaissance aircraft would spot her and call in a bombing raid long before she ever reached the water. So the dry dock at Yokosuka was entombed beneath a colossal concrete roof supported by massive steel girders. This turned the dock into a vast, dimly lit cavern where thousands of workers labored day and night. Those workers lived under near-total isolation. They slept in on-site barracks, forbidden to leave the yard or contact anyone outside. Military police patrolled the perimeter, enforcing silence with threats of imprisonment. Not a single photograph of Shinano's construction was allowed to leave the facility. Even among senior officers, only a handful were permitted to know her true specifications. Documents referred to her only by cryptic code names. To the outside world, and even to many within Japan, Shinano practically did not exist. But extreme secrecy came with a cost. Suppliers frequently didn't know what components they were contributing to. Departments that should have worked together operated blindly, separated by layers of classified restrictions. Errors that well-coordinated teams would have caught early instead slipped through unnoticed. The ship was enormous, and her design pushed the outer limits of what wartime Japan could accomplish. Fully loaded, Shinano displaced 71,890 tons, far more than any carrier ever built. Her armored flight deck could absorb the impact of 1,000-pound bombs. Her armored belt reached 8 inches thick at the waterline, an unheard-of level of protection for a carrier. The hangar deck was segmented by armored bulkheads intended to confine damage from bombs or torpedoes. And her power came from 4 steam turbines generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, enough to push her massive hull at 27 knots. Her defensive armament was equally extraordinary. 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns stood ready to engage aircraft or surface targets. Over 120 25mm anti-aircraft guns dotted her hull, layered to create fields of interlocking fire. 12 28-barrel rocket launchers, primitive but terrifying, could blanket the sky in a storm of explosive projectiles. In theory, Shinano was an aircraft carrier that could stand up to punishment no other carrier on Earth could endure. But beneath that armor and ambition lay a hidden truth. Shinano was being built in the middle of a collapsing empire. The veteran craftsmen who had constructed Yamato and Musasha were gone, drafted into the military or lost to the war. Their replacements were conscripts, college students, even prisoners of war. Quality control had deteriorated to levels unthinkable before the war. Welds that once would have been X-rayed for integrity were now inspected only visually. Tolerances that should have been measured in millimeters drifted into centimeter-wide gaps. And the pressure to finish Shinano was merciless. Tokyo demanded she be ready by November 1944. Work continued around the clock in stifling summer heat and bitter winter cold. Men fainted from exhaustion and were carried away, only to be replaced by fresh workers moments later. Accidents became common. Men fell from scaffolding or were crushed between steel plates. Others succumbed to the toxic fumes of welding in the poorly ventilated dock. Every death was hushed, every injury ignored. The war demanded progress, no matter the cost. Material shortages only made things worse. Special armor steel was sometimes diverted to other emergency projects. Substitutes, often inferior, were used in its place. Electrical wiring imported before the war became impossible to replace. When stocks ran out, improvised solutions took their place, creating dangerous single-point failures in systems that should have had backups. In many ways, Shinano was being held together not just by engineering, but by sheer force of will. And yet, despite everything, she grew. Month by month her hull rose from the dock. Her immense flight deck stretched toward completion. Her island superstructure took shape along her starboard side. Workers, exhausted, hungry, and half-frozen, would pause during the rare quiet moments just to stare at her. Even unfinished, she was overwhelming. A floating city, a monument to ambition, a last, desperate symbol of an empire struggling against the tide of defeat. She was becoming a ship meant to change the course of the war. But the war would reach her first. On the morning of October 8, 1944, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal stood poised on the edge of triumph. For 4 long years, its greatest secret had been hidden under concrete and steel, Japan's boldest gamble in naval engineering. Now, at last, Shinano was to meet the sea. Anticipation rippled through the shipyard. This launch was meant to be more than a milestone. It was intended as a declaration that Japan, despite air raids, shortages, and a tightening blockade, could still forge wonders of steel. The day began with ceremony rooted in centuries of tradition. At dawn, Shinto priests in white ceremonial robes stepped onto the dock, their movements slow and deliberate. They swept gohei, wands of white paper streamers, through the air, chanted ancient invocations, and cast salt in ritual purification. An altar stood at the vessel's bow, adorned with offerings of rice, fish, and sake. The priests called upon the kami, the spirits of wind, water, and forged metal, to bless the ship and guide her toward victory. High-ranking naval officers arrived in immaculate dress uniforms, heavy with medals polished for the occasion. Representatives of the imperial household took their places. Workers who had labored for years under suffocating secrecy were issued clean clothes and lined up in neat ranks, exhaustion momentarily swept aside by pride. Military bands played martial music. Flags fluttered from every vantage point. For the first time since construction began, portions of the concrete roof that had concealed Shinano were removed, allowing beams of sunlight to fall across her enormous hull. The launch plan had been rehearsed meticulously. Dry dock number 6 would be flooded through controlled valves. As the water rose, Shinano would lift gracefully from her blocks, float free, and be guided by tugs toward the fitting-out pier. It was a process the shipyard knew well. Hundreds of vessels had made their first contact with the sea in exactly this way. What could go wrong? At 10:30 a.m., the order was given, begin flooding. Workers spun the valve wheels, and seawater surged into the dock. At first, everything proceeded as expected. The water level climbed steadily, creeping up Shinano's immense hull. Spectators watched as the steel giant began to stir. Then, disaster erupted without warning. The caisson gate that sealed the dry dock from Tokyo Bay, an enormous steel barrier meant to withstand the ocean's pressure, gave way. It did not bend or leak gradually. It collapsed. Instead of a controlled flooding, an uncontrolled torrent of seawater exploded into the dock. The sound was like a cannonade, a deep thunder that echoed across Yokosuka. Millions of gallons of water burst inward with unstoppable force. Shinano did not rise. She was launched violently, hurled forward by sheer hydraulic power. 70,000 tons of steel shot ahead like a massive cork blasted from a bottle. She smashed into the far wall of the dock with an impact so violent that windows shattered a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables as thick as a man's snapped like threads, whipping through the air with lethal speed. One cable decapitated a worker. Another crushed 3 men against a crane. The ship recoiled, then swung sideways, her stern slamming into the opposite wall. Back and forth she lurched, a pendulum of destruction ripping through everything in her path. For minutes that felt endless, chaos consumed the yard. Workers ran blindly, some leaping into the churning water to escape the swinging hull. Others were swept away or crushed. Officers shouted orders drowned beneath the roar. The carefully planned ceremony disintegrated instantly. Instruments from the band scattered. Flags tore free. The The Shinto altar shattered into splinters. When the water finally stabilized, Shinano drifted to a stop. Survey teams inspected the damage. Miraculously, the ship's structure had survived. Her hull showed dents, buckled railings, and twisted steel, but no catastrophic harm. The human toll, however, was brutal. 17 workers dead, 43 injured. Some bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea or crushed beyond recognition. And worse still was the psychological blow. To the workers and sailors of Japan, ships were not lifeless machines. They were sacred beings, vessels with souls. A launch marred by violence was considered a curse. This, an uncontrolled, deadly, chaotic plunge, was the worst omen imaginable. Whispers spread through Yokosuka. She killed men before she even touched the sea. The ocean rejected her. The kami turned their faces away. Captain Toshio Abe, newly appointed commander, tried to stamp out the superstition. A veteran who had survived Midway, Abe had little patience for irrational fear. In a stern address to his crew, he declared, "Steel and engines have no spirit. Battles are won through discipline, not omens." But as he spoke, he could already see doubt lingering in the eyes before him. Sailors are superstitious by nature. Japanese sailors, doubly so. Many made quiet offerings at nearby shrines, praying for protection against what they believed to be a cursed ship. Repairs from the launch disaster were rushed. Damaged plates were cut away and replaced. Bent railings hammered straight. Paint covered the scars, but not the memory. Within 3 weeks, Shinano looked whole again, but those who had witnessed the launch could still hear the screams, still see the hull swinging wildly, still feel the sense that the ship had been born under a shadow. Work accelerated even further. The November deadline loomed, and the accident had cost time Japan no longer had. Safety protocols, already weakened, collapsed even more. Watertight doors were checked only for movement, not pressure integrity. Electrical systems received superficial inspections. If Shinano appeared complete, that was deemed good enough. Her crew reflected that same haste. Carriers normally trained their complements for months, drilling every role, from gunnery to aviation handling to firefighting and flooding control. Especially damage control, an art requiring coordination, calm, and deep familiarity with the ship. Shinano would have none of that. Her crew was cobbled together from veterans of sunken ships, raw recruits, and even civilian workers pressed into naval service. Many spoke different dialects. Many had never set foot on a carrier. Drills descended into confusion. Men lost in passageways, hoses placed in the wrong compartments, orders misunderstood. Efficiency was impossible, and the whispers of a curse only grew. Petty officers reported men seeking transfers, feigning illness, even injuring themselves to avoid serving aboard her. The ship's chaplain conducted blessing after blessing, but each ritual seemed to deepen the fear. If nothing was wrong, why did the ship need so many prayers? The shadow over Shinano was growing. November arrived with an almost tangible urgency. The deadline was no longer approaching, it had arrived. Ready or not, Shinano had to sail. Every day brought new reports of American submarines prowling Japanese waters, their numbers growing by the dozens. B-29 superfortresses were reaching farther across the Pacific, scouting, bombing, and threatening to find the giant carrier before she could even leave port. Time had run out. The final weeks of preparation were desperate. Equipment that should have been carefully installed was literally thrown aboard. Crates of supplies were stacked wherever space could be found. The special weapons she was to carry, 50 ochre-colored suicide rocket planes and several Shinano explosive motorboats, were loaded into her hangars. These weapons, themselves symbols of Japan's grim desperation, seemed almost fitting cargo for a desperate ship. On November 11, 1944, Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was subdued compared to the grandeur intended for her launch. No bands played, few dignitaries attended. Captain Toshio Abe read the official orders in a flat, measured voice. The rising sun flag rose slowly on her mast. She was now a warship, officially, but hardly ready for combat. The commissioning revealed her many vulnerabilities. Of her 12 boilers, Only 8 were operational, reducing her maximum speed from the designed 27 knots to about 20. Radar systems were only partially functional. Half of her anti-aircraft guns had inadequate ammunition. Aircraft elevators, critical for moving planes from hangar to flight deck, had never been load-tested. Most dangerously, many watertight doors, key to sealing off flooding compartments, had never been tested under pressure. Captain Abe compiled a 17-page list of deficiencies and submitted it to Naval Headquarters, requesting a delay to complete critical repairs. The response was swift and uncompromising. Shinano would sail as scheduled. Politics and propaganda outweighed caution. Word of the supercarrier's existence had leaked. She had to be revealed as a symbol of strength, not discovered destroyed in port. The sailing orders were clear. Depart Yokosuka on the night of November 28th, steam south along the coast, and reach Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea. There, narrow straits would shield her from submarines and distance would provide protection from air raids. The voyage would take only 20 hours. What could possibly go wrong in 20 hours? The crew prepared with a mixture of pride and dread. They were sailing aboard the world's largest warship, a floating city of steel and engineering genius. And yet, it was unfinished, fragile, and, according to whispers, cursed. Last letters were written home, personal effects stowed. Some men visited Shinto shrines, leaving offerings and prayers. Others drank sake to drown their fear. The escort was minimal: 3 destroyers, Iso-Ks, Yukikaze, and Hama-Ks. Experienced crews, but worn ships. Radar and sonar systems damaged in previous battles had only been partially repaired. To protect the world's largest carrier, this screening force seemed dangerously thin. But every available destroyer was needed elsewhere. Night fell on November 28, 1944, cloaking Yokosuka in deceptive calm. Shinano's massive hull loomed in the darkness. Steam hissed from her boilers. Navigation lights flickered to life. On the bridge, Captain Abe reviewed charts one last time. The route was simple: south along the coast around the Aizu Peninsula, then west to Kure. Travel at night, stay near the shoreline, avoid bombers, minimize exposure to submarines. At 6 p.m., Shinano's mooring lines were cast off. Tugs nudged her enormous bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering power. For the first time, she moved under her own engines. Despite the rushed construction, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she was magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet. Her flight deck soared 60 feet above the water. She displaced more than most harbors could accommodate. By any measure, she was a triumph of engineering, a floating fortress. The 3 destroyers fell into screening positions, Iso-Ks in the lead, Yukikaze and Hama-Ks on the flanks. Together, the 4 ships headed for the harbor entrance and the open sea beyond. As they passed through the protective submarine nets, several crew members noticed a small omen: a dead albatross floating in the water, wings outstretched like a surrender flag. Superstition ran deep aboard Shinano, and the sight sent shivers through some of the sailors. Unbeknownst to them, 30 miles to the south, USS Archerfish was beginning her patrol. The submarine had been on lifeguard duty, stationed to rescue downed American airmen from a cancelled bombing mission. Now free to hunt, Commander Joseph Enright brought his boat to the surface to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The night was perfect for a submarine, dark enough to hide their low silhouette, calm seas, just enough moonlight to catch a silhouette. At 8:48 p.m., Archerfish radar operator called out, "Contact, bearing 020, range 12 miles." On the screen, a large, steady blip moved southwest at about 20 knots. Enright rushed to the bridge, binoculars raised. On the horizon, a dark mass loomed, flanked by smaller shapes, the destroyers. His pulse quickened. This was no merchant ship. The size, the speed, the escorts, it was a major warship. "Battle stations," Enright ordered quietly. Through the submarine, men snapped to their positions with practiced efficiency. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked their weapons, hearts pounding. The hunt had begun. In Shinano's control room, plotting teams hunched over charts and calculating boards, tracing lines, and angles like mathematicians of death. The hunt had officially begun. Commander Joseph Enright faced an immediate dilemma. The target was moving at 20 knots, while Archerfish's maximum surface speed was 19. In theory, the submarine couldn't catch her, but Enright knew Japanese ships often zigzagged to evade submarines. Each turn slowed them down. If he could anticipate the pattern, cut the corners, and strike at the right moment, he might close the distance. For the next hour, Archerfish pushed her 4 diesel engines to the limit. The submarine vibrated with effort, her steel hull cutting through the swells, sea spray breaking over the bow. Below decks, engineers coaxed every possible revolution from the engines. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men rotated between the suffocating engine room and the fresh air above deck, lungs burning, hands blistered, sweat pouring down their faces. Every moment was a race against both machine and sea. On Shinano's bridge, radar operators detected the American submarine almost immediately. The system was only partially functional, but it worked well enough to pick up a surface contact several miles away. Captain Abe's expression remained grimly composed. Submarines were expected. These waters were infested with them, but he had contingency plans. "Signal the escorts," he ordered. Enemy submarine bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Abe's tactical situation was perilous. Shinano, despite her immense size, was vulnerable. She had no aircraft to spot submarines, and her sonar was barely operational. She depended entirely on her escorts, whose sonar had been damaged in previous battles and repaired with inferior components. Their depth charge racks were only partially loaded. Supplies were short. Fuel was precious. Every decision carried risk. If the destroyers pursued the submarine, Shinano could be left exposed to other lurking predators. But keeping the escorts close meant the trailing submarine could shadow them, radioing positions to others. Abe chose the safest option, or at least the least catastrophic. He ordered the standard evasive pattern, zigzag number 7. The massive ship began a series of wide, deliberate course changes, 45 degrees to port for 10 minutes, 60 to starboard for 8, back to base course for 15, then repeat. It was a standard anti-submarine tactic, but it carried heavy costs. Fuel consumption soared, the 20-hour voyage would stretch longer, and an experienced submarine commander could predict the pattern. And Enright was exactly that. In Archerfish control room, the plotting team tracked every turn, plotting angles and measuring intervals. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobczynski, executive officer, leaned over the chart table. "She's following a standard pattern. If we cut across her turns, we can gain distance." The hunt became a deadly game of geometry. Shinano would turn, opening the gap. Archerfish would cut the corner, closing it again. Precision and nerve were everything. One miscalculation, and contact would be lost. One error, and the destroyers would rain depth charges down on them. As the chase stretched into the night, Shinano's incomplete construction began to show its vulnerabilities. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft overheated. The massive shaft, spinning at high speed, generated more friction than the hastily installed bearing could handle. Temperature gauges climbed into the red. The engineering officer faced a terrible choice: maintain speed and risk catastrophic failure, or slow down and give the submarine an opening. He chose caution. Speed dropped from 20 knots to 18. It seemed minor, but it was critical. Now Archerfish didn't just keep pace, she could gain ground. Below, the sonar operator's voice was calm but tense. "She's slowing." Enright allowed himself a tight, controlled smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in his favor. But Shinano's troubles were only beginning. The relentless zigzagging, combined with her rushed construction, stressed systems throughout the ship. Electrical connections, hastily installed, began failing. Lights flickered in compartments. Ventilation fans stopped, turning already oppressive lower decks into ovens. Engine room crews rotated every 20 minutes to stave off heat exhaustion. More dangerously, the constant rolling and flexing of the hull caused inadequately welded seams to work open. Not enough for immediate flooding, but enough to let water seep into lower compartments. Pumps were started, but several failed under pressure, they had never been properly tested. The massive ship, born of ambition and secrecy, now showed the human cost of haste, its flaws exploited by the unforgiving physics of the sea and the patient predator hunting it. On Shinano's bridge, Captain Abe received a relentless stream of reports. Minor mechanical failures here, overheating there, but together they painted a grim picture, a ship struggling under the weight of her own size and haste-built construction. Every new alarm chipped away at his confidence. He faced an agonizing choice: slow down and nurse the ship to port, making her a slower, easier target, or push ahead and risk catastrophic failures. He chose compromise, reducing speed to 16 knots and moderating the zigzag pattern, hoping to balance speed and survivability. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly dance had been underway for more than 5 hours. Archerfish had closed to within 7,000 yards, still too far for a torpedo strike, but close enough to maintain relentless tracking. The submarine crew was exhausted, yet exhilarated. The thrill of the hunt pulsed through them. They could feel the massive carrier slipping within their grasp. Enright studied the plotting charts with intense concentration. Shinano's pattern was becoming clear. Despite the zigzags, she consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees southwest toward Kerr Naval Base. If he could position Archerfish ahead of that line, predict the moment she steadied, the opportunity for a decisive strike would come. "Take her down to radar depth," he ordered. The submarine slipped beneath the waves, leaving only the radar antenna visible above the surface. Archerfish now became a true predator of the night, unseen, silent, but watching. On Shinano, unease was mounting. The enemy submarine had been trailing them for hours. Why hadn't it attacked? Was it calling in reinforcements, laying a trap? Some officers whispered suggestions. Abe dismissed such talk, though privately he worried. American submarine tactics had grown sophisticated, coordinated, and aggressive. They no longer waited, they hunted. Then, at 2:56 a.m., fate intervened. Isokaze, the lead destroyer, sighted what her lookouts believed was a periscope off the starboard bow. Without hesitation, her captain increased speed, plowing through the darkness at 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice rose in alarm. High-speed screws approaching. Destroyer bearing 340, closing fast. Enright had mere seconds to decide. Crash dive and risk losing contact forever, or hold depth and risk detection. He ordered a shallow dive to 150 feet, enough to evade the destroyer but shallow enough to resurface quickly if needed. "Rig for silent running. Rig for depth charge," he commanded. The destroyer thundered overhead, her screws churning the water like pistons. Every man aboard Archerfish held his breath. The splash of depth charges seemed inevitable, but none came. Isokaze had lost contact, and more critically, had violated Abe's orders to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge forced her back into position, leaving Archerfish free to resume pursuit. Now the opportunity Enright had waited for all night was at hand. Shinano remained on course, 4,000 yards away, still unaware of the predator closing in. At 3:15 a.m., everything aligned. The carrier steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish. Range: 1,400 yards. Speed: 16 knots. Perfect. In submarine warfare, this was as close to a flawless setup as it got, angled for maximum target area, close enough for precision, slow enough to calculate a solution. Through the periscope, the sight struck Enright with awe. Shinano was colossal, beyond anything he had ever imagined. Her flight deck stretched like a cliff face. Her starboard island rose like a skyscraper. He could make out lights in the portholes, shadows moving along the deck, and the frothy white water curling at her bow. Quickly, he sketched her unique rounded hull, different from any carrier in the recognition manuals. "Final bearing and shoot," he ordered. "Make ready all tubes." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were loaded and primed. Each carried 600 pounds of torpex, capable of ripping a battleship-sized hole in steel. They had been troublesome earlier in the war, depth issues, faulty detonators, but now they were reliable. Enright set the depth unusually shallow at 10 feet, remembering advice from a senior officer. A high hit on a carrier's hull could compromise stability, not just cause flooding. The fire control party double-checked the solution. Target speed, angle, and range were fed into the analog torpedo data computer, which spat out precise firing angles. Calculations were checked, rechecked, and triple-checked. There would be no second chance. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered violently as the first torpedo was expelled from its tube. A blast of compressed air hurled the weapon into the darkness. Its propellers whirred to life immediately, driving it forward at 46 knots toward the massive silhouette of Shinano. Fire 2. 8 seconds later, a second torpedo launched, the delay carefully calculated to let the first clear the tube. Then 3, 4, 5, 6. In under a minute, 6 lethal projectiles were racing silently through the cold night waters, each carrying a 600-pound charge of Torpex, enough to shred steel and concrete alike. Their faint wakes traced straight, deadly lines toward the carrier's starboard side. On Shinano's bridge, the first glimpse came too late. "Torpedo, starboard," a lookout shouted. Captain Abe barked orders for full rudder, but the enormous carrier responded sluggishly. Her bulk was immense, and the water resisted every turn. Before she could even begin to swing, the first torpedo struck. The explosion was catastrophic. A geyser of water erupted alongside the hull, shooting higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched violently to port. The second torpedo followed immediately, then the third, then the fourth. 4 torpedoes struck within 30 seconds, all along the starboard side, concentrated between the bow and the island superstructure. The first hit at frame 104, near an aviation fuel tank that, by luck, was empty. Still, the explosion tore a 20-foot wide gash in the hull, flooding adjacent compartments instantly. The second slammed into frame 142, obliterating the starboard outboard engine room. Men on duty there were killed instantly, engulfed in seawater and superheated steam. The third struck frame 166, tearing open the number 3 fire room to the ocean. The fourth hit frame 190, rupturing another fuel tank and sending oil gushing into passages, igniting a slick of black fire on the water. On the bridge, the enormity of the attack hit slowly. Shinano was enormous, a floating fortress designed to absorb punishment. Abe's first thought was that the armor might hold. After all, she had been built like a battleship. But below decks, disaster had already taken root. Watertight doors, never tested under real conditions, failed immediately. Some jammed shut, trapping men in rapidly flooding compartments. Others refused to close at all. Hastily welded seams split under the immense pressure. Electrical panels, soaked by the surging water, sparked and erupted in showers of fire. Damage control teams rushed to respond, but the crews had never trained together. Conflicting orders, confusion, panic, it was chaos. Some teams counterflooded port compartments to correct the list, while others pumped at the same flooded areas, working at cross purposes. In the engine rooms, the situation became desperate. Starboard engines were submerged. Engineers waded through chest-deep water trying to keep pumps running. When water reached electrical panels, sparks and small explosions forced men back. One by one, the starboard engines fell silent. The list worsened steadily. 5 degrees, 10, 13. On the flight deck, aircraft, vehicles, and loose equipment began to slide uncontrollably. Sailors formed human chains to stop the chaos, but it was futile. A fuel truck smashed into the island superstructure. Crates of ammunition tumbled into the sea, creating showers of splintered wood and metal. Captain Abe remained rigid on the bridge, issuing counterflooding orders, setting course for the nearest land, hoping desperately to beach the ship. He transmitted coordinates to Naval Headquarters. Shinano, torpedoed, position 32 degrees 0 minutes north, 137 degrees 0 minutes east, attempting to reach shore. But deep down, Abe knew the truth. Reports from below decks were uniformly grim. Flooding was uncontrollable, pumps were failing, and half the crew didn't even know their assigned damage control stations. The ship was dying. Meanwhile, back aboard Archerfish, Enright had already taken his submarine deep, evading immediate counterattack. Now came the most dangerous moment for any sub, the deadly dance of survival while the enemy desperately sought to hunt you as you had just struck the heart of their fleet. Above them, Japanese destroyers raced frantically, sonar pinging through the dark waters, crews at their depth charge stations, hearts pounding. 400 feet, Enright ordered. Rig for silent running. The submarine descended into the darker depths, each man holding his breath, moving almost imperceptibly. The sounds of the hunt reached them from above, the whining roar of screws, the ping of active sonar, the sudden splash of depth charges entering the water. The first pattern exploded. 5 charges detonated in sequence. Archerfish shuddered, lights flickered, insulation rained from the ceilings, but the blasts were distant, at least 500 yards away. Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, could not pinpoint the submarine. More depth charges followed, 14 in total, but none struck close enough to threaten serious damage. After an hour, the noises faded. The destroyers had abandoned the hunt, returning to protect their stricken carrier. At dawn, November 29th, Shinano's nightmare continued. The list had worsened to 20 degrees. Walking the tilted decks became nearly impossible. Sailors clutched ropes to navigate the slanted surfaces. In the hangar, the ochre-colored suicide planes had broken free, sliding into one another, their volatile rocket fuel creating an immediate fire hazard. Progressive flooding, water sneaking through doors, vents, cable runs, and any opening, spread like cancer, engulfing compartments that should have been watertight. Thousands of tons of water dragged Shinano lower with every passing minute. Captain Abe made one final desperate attempt. All engines were ordered ahead full, trying to push the crippled carrier toward shore. But with only the port engines functioning, Shinano crawled forward at 10 knots, circling helplessly as her rudder struggled against the uneven thrust. At 8:30, Abe authorized the emergency signal, "Prepare to abandon ship." It was a warning, not an order. Yet men began gathering on the flight deck, helping wounded comrades from below and donning life jackets. The destroyers moved closer, ready to take survivors aboard. Below decks, acts of courage and tragedy unfolded in equal measure. Engineers clung to their posts, trying to keep pumps and lights operational until water forced them out. Medical officers worked in slanting sick bays, evacuating patients as best they could. In one compartment, 30 men were trapped behind a jammed hatch, hammering in vain for over an hour until silence fell. The end came swiftly. At 10:18, the list surged to 35 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and men slid uncontrollably down the flight deck into the churning sea. "Abandon ship," the order rang out. But for many, it was already too late. Men trapped below decks drowned, others fell from the tilting deck, some jumping 60 feet into the water, many meeting death on impact. Captain Abe remained on the bridge, adhering to tradition. He tied himself to the helm, maintaining composure as water rose around him. Senior officers followed suit, singing the national anthem as the mighty ship went down. At 10:55, Shinano capsized. Her flight deck passed vertical, then rolled completely over. For a fleeting moment, her colossal hull was visible, red anti-fouling paint and barnacles glinting in the morning light. Then, with a tremendous roar of escaping air, she plunged beneath the waves. The largest warship in the world had survived just 17 hours at sea. The sea around the sinking ship was a scene of chaos and despair. Over 2,000 had been aboard. Hundreds struggled in oil-slicked waters. The 3 destroyers wove through the survivors, picking them up selectively. Tradition dictated that officers were saved first. Men in panic were sometimes left behind. Those coated in oil slipped beneath the waves, hypothermia claiming more as the winter waters sapped strength. By the end, only 1,080 men had been rescued. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most senior officers, were lost. It was one of the largest single-ship casualties of the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic, but it was also a state secret. Shinano's existence and demise would remain classified. Survivors were sworn to silence. Families were told only that their loved ones had perished in action, without details. Official records were sealed. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. Yet in war, secrets are fragile. Whispers spread among sailors and dockyards. The tale of the great carrier, sunk in less than a day, would endure despite the veil of secrecy. American codebreakers, poring over intercepted messages, learned of the sinking within days. The name Shinano appeared in decoded traffic, accompanied by coordinates marking where the massive ship had been torpedoed. Intelligence officers were baffled. They had no record of a ship by that name. What had Archerfish actually sunk? When Commander Enright submitted his patrol report in December, claiming to have destroyed a carrier of unprecedented size, skepticism greeted him. Navy intelligence insisted no such vessel existed. The highest they would credit him with was a 28,000-ton carrier, still impressive, but far smaller than reality. Only after the war, when American investigators accessed captured Japanese records, was the truth revealed. Shinano had displaced 71,890 tons fully loaded. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built at the time and remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Enright's instincts, proven correct, earned him lasting redemption. The story of Shinano's single, tragic voyage is more than a historical footnote. It is a lesson in hubris and humility, in ambition undone by fundamental flaws. It shows how even the mightiest weapon can fall to the smallest predator when circumstances align. For Japan, Shinano was a symbol of the failures of their decisive weapon strategy. Throughout the war, Japanese planners had relied on singular superweapons, massive battleships, kamikaze attacks, miraculous carriers. But wars are won by systems, not symbols. While Japan poured effort into a single colossal carrier, America produced dozens of smaller carriers. While Japan rushed an incomplete ship into the sea, the US trained crews and refined equipment. The outcome was inevitable. The technical lessons were equally clear. Size without reliability is a liability. Armor without proper damage control is an illusion of security. A ship's true strength lies not just in steel, but in the skill of her crew, the quality of her construction, the integrity of every weld, every watertight seal. Shinano failed not because her design was flawed, but because her execution was incomplete. For the submarine force, the sinking was a powerful validation. Relatively cheap vessels, crewed by fewer than 100 men, had destroyed a capital ship worth thousands of times their cost. The silent service had proven it could strike anywhere, at any time, against any target. The age of the submarine as a strategic weapon had arrived in full force. Commander Enright's personal journey, from early setbacks to ultimate triumph, resonated across the Navy. His story proved that failure need not define a career, that persistence, courage, and careful calculation could overcome past mistakes. The Navy Cross he received was not just for sinking Shinano, but for the determination to stay in the fight after earlier defeats. Yet the human cost haunts the tale. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors died, many conscripts forced into a war they had never sought. They perished trapped in flooding compartments, thrown from slanted decks, or abandoned in icy water. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. Shinano never launched a single plane in anger. She never defended her homeland, never fulfilled the colossal resources spent to build her. Today, Shinano rests in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omazaki, upside down, her flight deck slowly buried in sediment, her hull collapsing under the relentless pressure of the deep. She is both a tomb for the men lost and a monument to an age when nations believed that bigger automatically meant better, that one perfect weapon could change the course of war. Modern naval strategists study Shinano as a cautionary tale. In the era of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain painfully relevant. Complexity demands competence. Size requires support. No ship, no matter how massive, fast, or armed, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates it. Shinano is a reminder that even the greatest ambitions can sink in an instant if preparation, training, and human factors are ignored. The sinking of Shinano also highlights the cruel hand of chance in war. Had she sailed a day earlier, or later, had Archerfish been assigned elsewhere, had the torpedoes run slightly deeper instead of the shallow depths that struck her hull, history might have been rewritten. War is never just strategy and technology. It is also luck, timing, and the alignment of countless variables. On that November night in 1944, everything fell into place for Archerfish and catastrophically against Shinano. In the decades that followed, the story of Shinano and Archerfish became legendary in naval circles. Historians analyzed every detail, authors wrote extensively, and veterans shared memories that fleshed out the narrative we know today. Commander Enright went on to a distinguished career, retiring as a rear admiral. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking, embodying the quiet professionalism of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would simply say, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." Yet those who knew him understood the deeper truth. It was the vindication of his courage, the proof that he belonged in command, the second chance he had seized against all odds. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades. Aging sailors gathered to relive the tense hours of pursuit, the quiet dread before firing, and the explosive thunder when the torpedoes struck. They remembered the skill, the patience, and the nerve it took, but they also remembered the men of Shinano. Time had transformed former enemies into men who had simply served at sea. Some Japanese survivors eventually told their stories once secrecy lifted, describing the chaos, fear, and sheer awe as their mighty ship rolled and sank. They recalled officers and comrades who sacrificed themselves, giving up life jackets, pushing others to safety, or remaining behind to keep vital systems running until the water forced them under. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's final, futile gestures. Magnificent vessels launched too late, grandiose ambitions executed incompletely, and lives lost in vain. She epitomized the dangers of propaganda, hubris, and the belief that sheer size and power could shield one from disaster. For America, her sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could outmaneuver and destroy thousands in a massive carrier, that patience, skill, and calculated risk could defeat sheer brute force. It was David versus Goliath, written in steel and torpedoes. The wreck of Shinano was rediscovered in 2019 by deep-sea explorers. Images revealed a ship remarkably intact despite decades underwater. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had withstood pressures that would have crushed lesser vessels. Yet she rests inverted, her intended glory forever buried beneath layers of sediment, a monument to ambition that outstripped capability. Today, as nations once again raced to build the largest, most powerful warships, Shinano's story remains a warning. Technology may advance, but the human factors that doomed her endure. Ships are still rushed into service, crews still sail undertrained, and leaders still hope a single supreme weapon can alter fate. The ghost of Shinano whispers against such hubris. The final lesson is universal. In war, as in life, the swift do not always win, nor the strong always prevail. Sometimes patience defeats power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. And sometimes, a single night can echo through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the razor-thin line between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built. The other was a standard submarine, unremarkable in any way, except for the men who commanded her. By sunrise, only one remained. That is the brutal nature of war at sea, sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean shows no favoritism to size or strength. It swallows all alike, keeping its secrets in the dark depths where Shinano rests, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. A giant felled by a predator she never truly saw.